I still remember the sting of her words, as if they were carved into my skin with a knife. My daughter-in-law stood there in her glittering gown, her voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, and she looked me straight in the eyes as she said, "The greatest gift you could give us for our wedding is to disappear from this family." The laughter and chatter around us died instantly, and the silence that followed seemed to echo louder than her cruel sentence. I stood frozen, my hands trembling as I clutched the edge of the chair to keep from collapsing, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might shatter my chest. I searched my son's face, desperate for him to speak, to defend me, to tell her she was wrong, but his lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes darted away like a child caught in shame. That silence, his silence, was heavier than her words. At that moment, it was not just my daughter-in-law rejecting me, it was my own blood allowing it to happen. I had dreamed of this wedding for months, not because of the decorations or the guests or the ceremonies, but because I believed it would be a celebration of everything I had endured, everything I had given, everything I had built for my son. I had poured what little savings I had into making it beautiful. I sold my jewelry, pieces I had kept hidden for years, as the last memory of my husband, so that the banquet hall could be booked and the catering paid for. I stayed up through endless nights, sewing linens, polishing old family silver, planning every detail so that he would have the kind of wedding I could never dream of for myself. I thought it would be the moment when he finally looked at me with pride and said, "Mama, you gave me everything." But instead I was told that the best gift I could give was my absence, as if my presence were an embarrassment, as if my life were nothing but a stain on their happiness. My ears rang as though the words had struck me physically, and I felt the room spinning. I wanted to shout, to demand how she dared to speak to me like that, but the words caught in my throat, tangled with the tears I refused to shed in front of her. Instead I stood there, silent, my body rooted like an old tree that has weathered too many storms. Around us the guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking between her painted smile and my still figure, but none of them spoke. It is strange how silence multiplies cruelty, how a single insult can grow into a mountain when no one moves to stop it. My son touched her arm lightly, as though calming her, and the gesture tore at me more than her words. He did not defend me, he did not scold her, he chose her pride over my dignity. That night, when the music faded and the guests had gone, I sat alone in the small room they had given me at the back of the house. My body ached from exhaustion, but it was my heart that carried the heaviest weight. I looked at the photographs scattered across my bed, the picture of my son as a baby, wrapped in a torn blanket, the picture of him at school, holding his first certificate, the picture of him as a young man in his graduation gown. Every image was soaked in my sacrifices, my sleepless nights, my empty stomachs, my blistered hands. I remembered the day his father died, leaving me alone with a child and debts I had no idea how to pay. I remembered walking miles to the factory every morning, the machines roaring in my ears until they became part of my dreams, my body bent over work that chewed up my youth and left me with nothing but scars. I remembered skipping meals so he could eat, lying to him that I had already eaten at work, watching him smile while I swallowed the hunger like poison. And now, after everything, I was told that the greatest gift I could give was to disappear. I stared at my hands, wrinkled and tired, the skin stretched thin over veins that rose like rivers beneath the surface. These hands had built a life from nothing. These hands had held him when he was sick, had wiped his tears when he was heartbroken, had packed his lunches, mended his clothes, clapped for him when he achieved, carried him when he stumbled. And yet these same hands, now trembling, were seen as useless, as burdensome, as unworthy of the new life he wanted to build. I pressed them together tightly, as though I could hold myself from breaking, and I whispered into the darkness, "You may wish me gone, but I am not so easily erased. I am the roots of this tree, and without me it would never have grown." Sleep did not come that night. Instead, memories came flooding back, uninvited and merciless. The winter nights when we had only one blanket, and I wrapped it around him while I shivered through the cold. The summers when I worked double shifts, my hands raw from washing laundry for wealthier families, so that he could have books and shoes like the other children. The festivals when I wore the same old sari year after year, but made sure he had something new so he would never feel less than his friends. I gave him not just my time and my money, but my very youth, my dreams, my health. And in return I was told that my presence was the greatest burden of all. The pain was sharp, but beneath it, something else began to stir, something I had not felt in years. It was not anger, not yet. It was resolve. The morning after her words still sat on my chest like a stone, and though the sun rose, and the house filled with noises of preparation for the days ahead, my world remained dim, clouded by the echo of her cruelty. I moved through the kitchen like a shadow, my hands steady but my heart unsteady, each sound reminding me of how much I had given for the very people who now wished me gone. As I brewed the tea, I remembered the first time I had ever seen my daughter-in-law. She had walked into our modest home years ago, dressed in clothes that looked too polished for our neighborhood, her perfume strong, her eyes quick and scanning everything as though she were assessing its value. My son was smitten, smiling in a way I had never seen before, his words tumbling over each other in eagerness to impress her. I had welcomed her with open arms, offering her food I had saved for days to prepare, food I could barely afford. She had smiled politely, but her eyes had flicked past me as though I were furniture, something to be tolerated but not acknowledged. Even then there was a part of me that knew she did not see me as part of their future. But I swallowed the doubt, because I told myself my son's happiness mattered more than my unease. In the years that followed, the distance only grew. She rarely spoke to me directly, preferring to address me through my son, even when I was in the same room. If she wanted something cleaned, she would say to him, "Your mother can take care of it, can't she?" If she wanted something bought, she would sigh and remark, "It's a shame we don't have enough, but maybe she can help." And each time I nodded. I agreed. I stretched my already thin means just a little further. I pawned my jewelry to contribute to their first car, telling my son it was from my savings, so he would not know what I had lost. I worked quietly in the background, sewing clothes for neighbors, scrubbing floors for strangers, pretending I was simply keeping myself busy, while in truth every coin was set aside for him and the life he wanted to build with her. I convinced myself that this was love, that one day they would look back and see what I had done and thank me. But thank yous never came, only more demands. The cruelest irony is that every sacrifice I made was rooted in the hope of being included, of being cherished in their new life. When they first began planning the wedding, my son came to me nervously, confessing that the costs were too high, that they didn't have enough to make it what they wanted. I remember taking his hand in mine, my voice steady though my heart was breaking, and saying, "Don't worry, my child. I will make sure your day is everything you dream of." And I meant it. I sold the last piece of land my husband and I had saved for, the land we had once dreamed of building a small home on when we were old. I told myself it was worth it, because seeing my son happy was more important than any dream of mine. I handed him the money without hesitation, watching the relief wash over his face, the joy in his eyes, and for that fleeting moment I felt it had all been worth it. But joy is fleeting when it is not built on gratitude. That very money I had sacrificed so much to give was now being used to fund the wedding, where his bride would tell me to disappear. That night, after her words, I walked through my memories like walking through ruins of a once beautiful city. I saw myself as a young widow, standing at the factory gates for the first time, the weight of my son on my hip, and the supervisor's eyes scanning me with doubt. I saw the years that followed, the endless lines of laundry hanging in the sun, the cracked skin of my hands from scrubbing floors, the moments when my body screamed for rest, but I pushed it aside because my son needed shoes, books, medicine. I remembered the night he had a fever so high I thought I would lose him, and I ran barefoot through the dark streets to the pharmacist, pressing my last gold bangles into his hand, begging him to save my child. He lived, and I thought my life had meaning because of it. Every scar on my body was a mark of love, every ache in my bones a reminder of what I was willing to endure for him. And now, the woman he had chosen stood before me and told me the best gift I could give was to disappear. But beneath the grief, something hardened. I realized in that moment that I had been building my entire life on the hope of gratitude, on the expectation of acknowledgement, when in truth the world does not always reward sacrifice with love. Sometimes it rewards it with contempt. And yet I was not powerless. For all their arrogance, for all her cruelty, they did not know the truth of what I still carried. They thought I had given everything, that I had nothing left but my old age and my silence. They did not know of the small savings I had tucked away, the documents I had guarded like treasure, the quiet plans I had made in the years when I feared what the future might hold. They did not know that though they mocked my presence, their future still rested in the hands they wanted to erase. That realization was like a spark in the darkness. I had been hurt, humiliated, betrayed, but I was not finished. My silence was no longer surrender. It was the space in which I would gather the strength to remind them who I truly was. The days after her words stretched into a haze of silence and unease. I carried on with my routines as though nothing had been said, but inside me something had shifted. I no longer moved with the eagerness of someone trying to belong, trying to be accepted. Instead, I moved with the patience of someone waiting for a storm to break. Clara noticed, though she mistook it for weakness. She looked at me differently now, with a smugness that cut deeper than her insults, as though by telling me to disappear she had stripped me of my last shred of worth. She would pass me in the hallways, with her chin lifted, her perfume clinging to the air like her arrogance, and she would smile with tight lips that never reached her eyes. "Don't trouble yourself," she would say in a voice too sweet to be genuine. "We'll manage without you." I would nod quietly, though inside I was thinking, yes, you will manage, but not in the way you imagine. My son was more difficult to read. At first he avoided me, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of fear of confronting what had been said. He left early for work, came home late, and spoke in half sentences that fell into the silence between us like stones into water. One evening, as I sat in the kitchen peeling vegetables, he entered quietly and lingered at the door. His face was pale, his jaw tight, and for a moment I thought he might finally speak the words I had been waiting for. "Mama, I am sorry. Mama, I should have stopped her." But instead he only asked if I needed help carrying the groceries tomorrow, his voice low, his eyes averted. I shook my head and he nodded quickly, retreating before I could say more. That was the cruelty of his silence. It was not born of malice, but of cowardice, and cowardice wounds as sharply as contempt. I began to turn my nights into hours of planning. When the house was quiet and their laughter had faded upstairs, I would sit in my small room and unlock the old wooden box I had kept hidden for years. Inside were the documents I had gathered through decades of struggle, receipts, land deeds, bank papers that bore my name in ink, faded, but still legible. These were the remnants of a life I had fought to build, fragments of security I had guarded, even as I gave away everything else. I traced my fingers over them slowly, remembering the stories behind each piece, the small piece of land my husband and I had purchased before his death, which I had rented out quietly when times grew hard, the bank account I had opened with my first factory wages, where I deposited small amounts every month, amounts so tiny they seemed laughable then, but had grown into something significant now. They thought I had nothing left, that my sacrifices had emptied me. They did not know that I had kept something back, not out of selfishness, but out of fear that one day I might need to stand on my own again. That day had come. Clara's arrogance only grew in the weeks that followed. She began to drop hints about the future, speaking to guests about plans to buy a new house, about investments she and my son would make once the wedding gifts and money came in. I listened quietly, my face unreadable, though inside I was marking every word. She thought the world was already hers, that I was just a shadow that would eventually fade away. What she did not see was that every plan she made rested on foundations that still belonged to me, and with every boast she made, with every careless laugh, my resolve hardened. She had wished me gone, but I was still here, and my absence would not be the gift she imagined. It would be the curse of realizing too late that the empire she claimed was never hers to begin with. One night, after another tense dinner, where Clara had barely acknowledged me, I sat at my window watching the streetlights flicker. I thought of my husband, gone too soon, and wondered what he would say if he saw the state of our family now. Would he tell me to be patient? Would he tell me to forgive? Or would he remind me that dignity is not something to be begged for, but something to be reclaimed when it is taken? I pressed my palms together, the veins standing out beneath my skin, and whispered into the night, I will not let them erase me. I will not vanish from the story I wrote with my blood. In that moment, I knew the path ahead. I would not scream, I would not beg, I would not humiliate myself with desperation. I would wait, and when the time came, I would show them the truth they had chosen not to see. And when I did, it would not be me who disappeared. It would be their illusions, their arrogance, their false sense of power. Clara grew bolder with each passing day, as though my silence had confirmed to her that she had succeeded in making me small. She began to speak about me more openly, not just to my son, but to neighbours and relatives. Her words dipped in sweetness, but sharpened enough to cut. At a gathering one afternoon, as I carried cups of tea into the living room, she waved her hand toward me and laughed softly, saying, She insists on doing these little things, but I tell her it's not necessary. Sometimes I think she forgets her place. The words lingered in the air like smoke, and though the guests smiled awkwardly, no one challenged her. I lowered the tray onto the table carefully, my face calm, my body steady, but inside me a storm swirled. Forget my place, she had said, but I had not forgotten. I knew exactly who I was, exactly what I had endured, and exactly what I still carried. It was she who had mistaken my patience for absence, my silence for weakness. My son sat beside her, his smile strained, his fingers tapping nervously against his knee. I caught his eyes for the briefest moment, and in them I saw something I had not seen in years, shame. He looked away quickly, pretending to listen to the chatter around him, but the redness in his ears betrayed him. For a flicker of a second I allowed myself to feel pity for him. He was a man torn between the love for his wife and the debt he owed his mother, and in choosing to remain silent, he was destroying himself slowly. I wanted to tell him that it was not too late, that courage could still save him, but I said nothing. Some lessons must be learned the hard way. That night, when the house was quiet, I slipped out with my documents tucked inside my bag. My feet carried me down the familiar streets to the bank, where the clerk looked at me with polite surprise. "You're here again, Ma'am?" he asked gently, and I nodded. My hands shook slightly as I handed over the papers, but my voice was firm. "I want to make changes," I said. He listened patiently as I explained, his pen scratching against the forms, his eyes occasionally lifting to search mine for doubt. But there was no doubt. Every word I spoke was clear, every signature steady. When the papers were done, and he stamped them with finality, I felt as though a weight I had carried for decades had shifted from my shoulders. I walked home slower than usual, but lighter, the night air cool against my face. Clara and my son thought they were building their future on solid ground, but they had no idea the ground itself was shifting beneath their feet. The next morning, Clara caught me returning from the temple and raised her eyebrows suspiciously. "Out so early?" she asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Praying for us, I hope." I smiled faintly, looking her straight in the eye for the first time in weeks, and said, "Always." She laughed, but there was a flicker of unease in her gaze, as though something about my calm unsettled her. That flicker was enough for me. It meant she had sensed the change, even if she didn't understand it yet. As the days stretched on, I watched Clara weave her web of arrogance more tightly. She spoke often about the new house they would one day buy, the investments they would make, the wealth they would accumulate. My son nodded along, his face tight with the pressure of meeting expectations he could barely afford. I knew the truth, that much of what they dreamed was already beyond their reach, that the debts were mounting, that their lifestyle was not as secure as Clara boasted. But I said nothing. Let her dream. Let her build castles in the air. When the time came, those castles would crumble on their own, and she would learn what it meant to mock the very hands that had carried her comfort. And in the quiet of my room, I began to feel something I had not felt in years. Not joy, not peace, but power. The power of knowing the truth when others live in lies. The power of patience, of silence that is not surrender but strategy. I no longer felt the sting of her words in the same way. Instead, each insult she threw became another stone I stacked into the foundation of the lesson I would deliver. She wanted me gone, erased, vanished. But when the time came, she would learn that I was not a shadow to be dismissed. I was the root of this family, and roots do not disappear simply because someone wishes them to. Clara's arrogance ripened like spoiled fruit, growing louder, more careless, more bitter with each passing week. She had grown comfortable in believing I would never challenge her, that I would simply bow my head and fade into the background as she tightened her grip on my son and on the house that had once been built from my sacrifices. She began mocking me openly in front of guests, her laughter sharp as she told stories that painted me as forgetful, clumsy, a burden she endured out of kindness. "She's harmless," she would say, with a smile that carried venom. "Old people just need something to do. She fusses around the house like it's her kingdom, but really we let her because it keeps her happy." Her friends would laugh politely, but I saw the flickers of unease in their eyes, the way they glanced at me quickly and then away, embarrassed by her cruelty. Clara mistook their silence for agreement, just as she mistook mine for defeat. But I knew better. Silence has a way of storing power, and one day that power explodes in ways the arrogant cannot predict. My son grew thinner, his face drawn, the lines on his forehead deeper than his years should allow. I watched him at the dinner table, his fork moving food around his plate without eating, his eyes fixed on the table as Clara spoke on his behalf. He rarely looked at me anymore, and when he did, it was with eyes full of something that looked like guilt but not courage. Once, late at night, I heard them arguing upstairs, Clara's voice sharp and shrill, his low and desperate. "She doesn't belong here," Clara hissed, her words cutting through the walls. "How long do you expect me to live like this, with her shadow in every corner? I told you before the wedding, this was supposed to be our fresh start." My son mumbled something I could not hear, and then the slam of a door shook the silence that followed. I sat in my room, my hands folded in my lap, and felt the ache of betrayal again. But this time it was not a sharp wound. It was a slow burn, one that no longer consumed me but strengthened me. His silence had taught me more than his words ever could. It had taught me that I could no longer depend on him to defend me. I would have to defend myself, but I would do it in a way that would leave no doubt, no room for excuses, no chance for them to twist the truth. During the days I continued my routines, outwardly unchanged. I cooked, I cleaned, I tended to the small garden in the backyard. Clara thought my labor was proof of her control, but to me it was a reminder of what I had always been capable of, building, sustaining, surviving. Every seed I planted in the soil reminded me of the seeds I had planted in my son's life, seeds watered with my sweat and tears, and just as a garden requires patience to bloom, so did my plan. I had already shifted my savings, secured my papers, ensured that my legacy would not fall into hands that mocked me. What remained now was timing, the right moment when truth could not be denied, when silence would no longer be mistaken for surrender, but revealed as the weapon it had always been. One evening, as I was folding laundry, Clara entered my room uninvited. Her eyes swept over the old wooden box on my table, and she smirked. "Still keeping your little treasures?" she said mockingly. "Don't worry, you won't need them. We'll take care of everything from now on." I closed the box slowly, my hands steady, and met her gaze with a calmness that seemed to unsettle her. "I know you will," I said quietly, my voice soft but carrying weight. For the first time her smirk faltered, her eyes narrowing as though she sensed a meaning behind my words that she could not quite grasp. She left quickly, her perfume trailing behind her, but I knew that moment had planted a seed of unease in her mind. Good. Let her wonder. Let her question. A rattled mind reveals more weakness than open cruelty ever could. And so I waited, my silence sharper than any blade, my patience steadier than their arrogance. I knew the day would come when Clara's pride would push her too far, when she would humiliate me in a way that no one in the room could excuse, not even my son. And when that day came, I would not shout or curse or beg. I would simply reveal the truth that had been waiting quietly in the shadows all along. And when I did, it would not be me who disappeared from this family. It would be their illusions, their false pride, their belief that I was nothing but a burden. That day was coming closer, and I was ready. The moment came sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday evening, the house filled with relatives and neighbours who had come to see the newly married couple. The rooms buzzed with conversation and laughter, the air heavy with the smell of food and perfume. I moved quietly among them, carrying trays of snacks and cups of tea, not because anyone had asked me to, but because old habits are hard to break. My hands were steady, my face calm, but inside I could feel the weight of every pair of eyes that slid over me, seeing me not as a guest, but as a servant in my own home. I heard whispers as I passed, small mutterings that were not cruel but pitying, and pity can wound more deeply than scorn. Still I carried on, reminding myself that patience had brought me this far, and that patience would lead me to the moment I had been waiting for. Clara was in her element that evening, dressed in silk that shimmered under the lights, her laughter carrying through the room like a bell that demanded attention. She floated from guest to guest, her arm hooked through my son's, her words dripping with the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. But arrogance has a way of seeking its own stage, and Clara could not resist. As I approached with another tray, she stopped mid-sentence and turned toward me, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "Oh, don't mind her," she said, loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "She insists on hovering, always fussing. I told her the greatest gift she could give us was to disappear, but here she is, carrying trays like one of the servants. Old habits, I suppose." Laughter rippled through the group, not hearty but uneasy. the kind that people release when they do not know what else to do. Her words sliced through me, sharper even than the first time she had said them, because now they were not whispered in private, but thrown like daggers before an audience. I felt the sting rise in my chest, but I did not falter. I lowered the tray gently onto the table, my movements slow, deliberate, refusing to show the tremor in my hands. My son stood beside her, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to speak but could not find the courage. His silence burned hotter than Clara's words, and for a moment I thought I might collapse under the weight of it. But then something within me steadied. I looked around the room, at the guests whose eyes darted between pity and discomfort, at the walls that had witnessed every sacrifice I had ever made. And I realized that this was the moment I had been waiting for. Clara had created her own stage, and I would use it to show her the truth she had long ignored. I did not speak that night, not yet. To confront her then in the heat of her arrogance would have been to meet her on her terms, and I had no intention of lowering myself to her level. Instead I smiled faintly, so faintly that it unsettled even her, and I turned away without a word. The silence that followed was louder than any outburst could have been. I saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes, the way her laughter faltered, the unease that rippled through the room. Let her wonder, I thought. Let her laugh while she still can. Soon enough her laughter would die in her throat, not because I shouted her down, but because I would reveal a truth she could not laugh away. That night, when the guests had gone and the house lay in silence, I opened my wooden box once more. I spread the papers before me, the deeds, the savings, the accounts, all proof of what I had built, what I had protected, what they did not know existed. I traced the lines of my name with my finger, feeling the strength in every letter, and I whispered to myself, "You wanted me gone. Soon you will see what happens when you try to erase the very foundation you stand on." My heart no longer trembled with sorrow. It beat with steady resolve. Clara's cruelty had crossed its peak, and now the descent would begin. The days after that evening were different. Something had shifted in the air, though Clara pretended not to notice. She walked with her usual pride, her heels clicking against the floor, her laughter echoing through the house. But I saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes whenever I entered a room. It was small, almost hidden, but it was there, a hesitation, a narrowing of her gaze, as if she could sense that my silence was no longer the silence of defeat, but of preparation. My son seemed more restless too. He avoided long conversations, his words clipped and uncertain, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. Once I passed his room late at night and heard him whispering, his voice tight with desperation, "You shouldn't have said that in front of everyone." Clara's reply was sharp, her tone dismissive, and then the sound of something slammed against the floor. I paused outside the door, listening, my chest heavy. But then I walked away. Their battles were not mine to fight. My war was different, and it was one I would fight with dignity. I began to make small changes, so subtle that at first no one noticed. I stopped handling small expenses for the household, bills I had quietly paid for, years without acknowledgement. When the electricity bill arrived, I let it sit on the table untouched. My son frowned when he noticed it, asking if it had been paid, and I shrugged softly. "I thought you and Clara managed these things now," I said with a calmness that unsettled even me. He nodded quickly, a hint of guilt flashing across his face, and took it away. Soon after, the grocer came knocking, asking for the balance I had always settled quietly at the end of the month. I smiled politely and told him to ask Clara, and though her face turned red with embarrassment when he did, I remained silent, folding clothes as though nothing unusual had happened. These were small acts, but they were the first cracks in the illusion Clara had built, cracks that would only deepen as time passed. One afternoon, Clara invited a group of her friends over, parading them through the house with exaggerated pride, showing off gifts from the wedding and plans for future renovations. As I sat in the corner quietly sewing, one of her friends, perhaps out of genuine curiosity, asked, "How did you manage such a beautiful ceremony?" "It must have cost a fortune." Clara laughed, her eyes gleaming, and said, "Oh, we managed, we saved, we planned. It was all us." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment I felt the sting of erasure again. But then, for the first time, I allowed myself to speak. I lifted my head slowly, my voice steady, and said, "Yes, it was beautiful. Every coin I gave from my savings, every piece of jewellery I sold, every hour of work I poured into it was worth it for my son's happiness." The room grew still, the sound of my words slicing through the laughter like a blade. Clara's smile faltered, her face tightening as her friends glanced between us, their eyes wide with the realization of the truth. She laughed nervously and tried to wave it off, but the unease lingered. For once, it was not me who looked small. It was her. That night, she cornered me in the kitchen, her voice sharp and low, her face flushed with anger. "Why did you say that? Why do you insist on making me look bad in front of people?" I looked at her calmly, my hand steady as I folded the cloth in my lap. "I only spoke the truth." I said softly, "Is the truth so dangerous to you?" She glared at me, her lips trembling, but she said nothing more. She stormed away, slamming the door behind her, and I sat quietly, my heart strangely at peace. It was not victory yet, but it was a beginning. As I lay in bed that night, I thought of all the years I had bent myself into silence, all the times I had swallowed my pain to keep peace in the house, and I realized that peace built on humiliation is not peace at all. It is submission, and submission only feeds cruelty. No more. I would not raise my voice. I would not scream. I would not fight like Clara did, but I would speak slowly, deliberately, with the weight of truth behind every word. And with each truth I revealed, her empire of arrogance would begin to collapse. I did not need revenge. What I needed was respect, and if they would not give it willingly, then I would take it back in the only way I knew how, with patience, with dignity, and with unshakable resolve. The breaking point came on a night, much like the one that had first scarred me. Clara had once again filled the house with guests, this time boasting about a future purchase, a grand home in the better part of town. She moved through the room with her usual arrogance, her words dripping with entitlement, my son trailing behind her like a man dragged by invisible chains. The guests listened politely, their nods half-hearted, their eyes darting occasionally toward me as I sat in the corner quietly, my hands folded in my lap. I could see in their faces that they knew the truth, that whispers had begun to spread after my quiet revelation weeks earlier, but Clara was blind to it. She was too caught in her own pride, too sure of her position to notice the cracks forming around her. At one point, as I rose to bring another tray, she reached out and plucked it from my hands. with a sharp laugh. "You see," she said loudly, her eyes sweeping the room. "She insists on acting like this house belongs to her. Sometimes I wonder if she'll ever learn her place. Honestly, the best gift she could ever give us would be to finally disappear." The words fell into the room like poison, heavier this time, uglier, because they were not new but repeated cruelty. The guests froze, their smiles faltering, the laughter dying in their throats. My son stood rigid, his face pale, but still he said nothing. That silence cut me deeper than Clara's words ever could. I set the tray gently on the table, my movements slow, deliberate. Then I straightened, my back no longer bent, my eyes no longer lowered. For the first time in years, I let my voice carry across the room, calm but steady, strong enough to silence the murmurs. "Disappear," I repeated softly, letting the word hang in the air. "Is that truly what you want from the woman who built this family with her own hands? From the woman who worked through hunger so her child could eat? From the woman who sold her youth, her jewelry, her health so that this very house could be filled with laughter tonight?" The room was utterly still. Clara's smile faltered, her painted lips trembling as she opened her mouth but found no words. I turned slowly toward my son, my eyes meeting his, and for the first time in years I saw the boy I had raised staring back at me, lost inside the man who stood frozen before me. "Do you remember," I asked, my voice softer now, "the nights I sat by your bedside while you burned with fever, praying for one more breath, one more morning to see your smile? Do you remember the shoes you wore to school, bought with money I earned, scrubbing floors until my hands bled? Do you remember the land your father and I dreamed of building a home on, the land I sold so you could stand in this very room today? And yet you stand silent while your wife tells me that my greatest gift is to disappear." His eyes filled with tears, his lips trembling, but still he said nothing, his shame heavier than any apology could have been. I reached into the folds of my sari and drew out the papers I had carried close to me for weeks. I placed them on the table, the sound of the stack echoing louder than Clara's laughter had moments before. "This house," I said quietly, "is not built on your savings or your pride. It was bought with my labor, my sacrifices, and my husband's dreams. These papers carry my name, not yours. The bank accounts you thought were yours to spend are secured under my signature. Every stone you walk upon, every door you close, every meal you eat in this house exists because of me." Gasps rippled through the guests, their eyes wide with shock. Clara's face drained of colour, her hand shaking as she reached for my son's arm, but he stood motionless, staring at the documents as though they were a mirror reflecting all the truths he had tried to ignore. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. My calmness was louder than any scream could have been. "You wanted me to disappear," I said softly, my eyes locking with Clara's. "But it is not me who will vanish from this family. It is the illusions you built, the lies you told, the arrogance you wrapped around yourself like silk. That will fade. But me, I am the root of this family, and roots do not disappear." The silence that followed was crushing. Clara's friends looked away, uncomfortable, their polite smiles gone. My son's tears fell silently, his shoulders shaking under the weight of his shame. Clara tried to laugh, tried to dismiss my words as the ramblings of an old woman, but her voice cracked, her eyes betraying the fear that had finally taken hold. I turned away then, not because I was defeated, but because I was done. I had spoken my truth, revealed my strength, and left them to live with the echoes of their cruelty. The house was not the same after that night. The walls seemed to carry the weight of my words, echoing them back in the silence that followed the guest's departure. Clara moved through the rooms like a shadow stripped of its brightness, her laughter forced, her eyes darting nervously whenever she caught mine. She no longer mocked me openly, no longer paraded her arrogance before others. Instead, she grew quiet, restless, her hands fidgeting with the folds of her dresses as though she were searching for a way to piece back together the pride that had shattered before so many witnesses. My son was worse. He avoided my gaze altogether, his shoulders bent as if the truth I had spoken pressed down on him like a weight too heavy to bear. I would hear him late at night, pacing in his room, his voice low and broken as he whispered apologies he did not have the courage to speak aloud to me. Neighbours began to treat me differently too. Where once they smiled politely and looked past me, now they greeted me with warmth, their voices gentle, their eyes filled with something closer to reverence than pity. Some came quietly to my door, pressing my hands into theirs and whispering, "We didn't know. We had no idea." I only smiled faintly, because I had not done it for them, and I did not need their pity or their belated respect. I had spoken because dignity demands to be seen, because silence can protect only so long before it becomes a prison. My words had freed me that night, and whatever followed was not for me to carry. It was for Clara and my son, who would now have to live with the truth they had chosen to ignore for so long. In the weeks that followed, Clara became more cautious, her sharp tongue dulled, her laughter brittle. She tried at times to regain her old confidence, to smile as she once had, but it no longer rang true. Her friends stopped visiting as often, and when they did, their eyes lingered on me with respect that made her squirm. She still looked at me with bitterness, but beneath it was fear, the kind of fear born not of violence but of truth. My son withdrew further into himself, speaking less, eating little, his guilt eating away at him quietly. Once he came to me late at night, standing in the doorway of my room with tears in his eyes. "Mama," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I don't know how to fix this." I looked at him for a long moment, my heart aching with the love that had never left me, no matter how deeply he had wounded me. "Some wounds cannot be fixed," I said softly. "They can only be remembered, so you do not cause them again." He bowed his head, and for the first time in years he knelt at my feet, pressing his forehead to my hands. I did not pull away. Forgiveness is not spoken. It is lived in the moments when you choose not to let bitterness consume you. Clara never apologized. Pride would not allow her to. But she grew quieter, less certain. Her arrogance cracked beyond repair. She still moved through the house, still clung to the life she believed she had built, but she did so with the awareness that it was not hers to command. She knew now that every door she opened, every meal she ate, every comfort she enjoyed, had been carved out of the sacrifices of the woman she had mocked. And though she never said it aloud, I could see it in the way her eyes lowered whenever I entered a room, in the way her laughter dimmed when I sat at the table. Respect had been forced upon her, not by shouting, not by anger, but by truth that could not be erased. And as for me, I found a peace I had not felt in years. I no longer longed for their gratitude, no longer ached for their acknowledgement. I had spoken my truth, and that was enough. In the quiet of my room, I would sit by the window and watch the world outside, my hands folded in my lap, my heart calm. I thought of my husband gone so long ago, and whispered to him in the silence, I carried us, my love. I carried him even when he forgot, and I did not disappear. I remained, I thought of all the mothers and grandmothers who had endured what I had endured, who had given everything and been treated as burdens. And I knew this story was not just mine, it belonged to them too. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with streaks of gold, I sat at the table while Clara busied herself silently in the kitchen, and my son hovered nearby. I looked at them both, the people I had sacrificed everything for, and the people who had wounded me most deeply, and I felt no hatred, only a deep, enduring truth. Mothers are not maids. We are not burdens. We are the roots of families, the builders of futures, the keepers of histories written not in books but in scars, in sacrifices, in love too deep to measure. They may laugh at us, they may try to erase us, they may wish us gone, but we do not disappear. We endure, and one day they always learn who we truly are. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Timeless Grandma Tales for more heartfelt journeys like this. I'd love to know, have you ever seen or experienced moments where a mother's sacrifices were taken for granted? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. USA, UK, Canada, Australia, or anywhere in the world. Let's build a community of kind souls who respect the silent strength of mothers and grandmothers